On Christmas Day in 1996, within a quiet neighborhood of Boulder, Colorado, a sickening murder unfolded that would send shockwaves across the nation. Amidst the twinkling lights and festive cheer, the murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Leaving behind an almost 30-year-old trail of unanswered questions and suspicions, this cold case draws us into a world where innocence collides with darkness. Welcome to the world of the arcane. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Arcane Archives podcast. My name is Cody, and thank you so much for joining me wherever you may be tuning in from. Before we start talking about the JonBenét Ramsey case, I would very quickly like to say a huge thank you to the support for not only our first episode last week, but for this new podcast as a whole. If you have not yet listened to last week's episode, make sure to finish this one, then head on over and listen to that one. In terms of getting this podcast up and running, I may try different things such as the way I structure my episodes, what I post on my social media accounts, or really anything in between. Down in the description of the episode will be a link for all of my social media accounts. Make sure to check those out. This episode does have content relating to things such as murder, molestation, and sexual assault. So please be aware of that before we continue. Let's travel back to Christmas night, 1996 in Boulder, Colorado. So let's set the scene a little bit. JonBenét Ramsey was born to John Bennett and Patricia Patsy Ramsey on August the 6th, 1990. Along with JonBenét, the Ramsey family had a 9-year-old son named Burke. JonBenét's name comes from squeezing her father's name, John and Bennett, together, forming the name JonBenét. For ease of our discussion, we will refer to the mother as Patsy, as that was a very common name for her. JonBenét was an American child beauty queen. She won a good amount of awards, including things such as the American Royale Miss, Little Miss Colorado, and National Tiny Miss Beauty. On the surface of this case, the information of her being a child beauty queen doesn't really seem to have any connection to her murder. It's important to understand all of the workings of the family, which is why I decided to include a little bit of her background. Jumping the gun a little bit here, in terms of possible theories, her quote-unquote popularity could have potentially influenced someone to commit the crime, but we'll obviously get more into that later on in the theories. So JonBenét Ramsey was murdered Christmas night, 1996, but it was not until the following morning that things started to actually happen. On the morning of December 26th, it was said that the family was getting ready to go on a trip or a vacation of some kind. While the parents were getting ready, Patsy claims to have discovered a ransom note on the stairs. The ransom note was 3 pages long, which, right off the bat, is a very odd characteristic of a ransom note. Certain officials in this investigation said that they had never ever seen a ransom note as peculiar as this one. I am going to read this whole ransom note to you just so you can have a full understanding of what it said and why people are claiming that this is really weird. So here's what it says. Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We do respect your business, but not the country that it serves. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in 100 bills. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money and hence an earlier delivery pickup of your daughter. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices, and if any are found, she dies. You can try to deceive us, but be warned that we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions and you stand a 100% chance of getting her back. You and your family are under constant scrutiny as well as the authorities. Don't try to grow a brain, John. You are not the only fat cat, so don't think that killing will be difficult. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good southern common sense of yours. It is up to you now, John. Victory. SBTC. So, as I said, ransom notes are hardly ever this long. As mentioned, this was 3 pages and very much outside the normalcy of what they usually are. Along with that, the specific demands for $118,000 was another weird thing about it. Now, the father, John, was addressed in the letter, and his company had been brought up. At the time, John was the president of a company called Access Graphics. John pointed out to the police when they first arrived that he had received a Christmas bonus that was around the same amount demanded by the ransom note. He claimed that the killer could have been someone who had access to his, potentially his company information, or at least their family finances. In a book about the murder called Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, there is an idea that the reason the ransom amount was so specific is because it had relation to Psalms 118. I won't read that passage for you, but I did read it myself, and it mainly talks about how the Lord has everlasting mercy, and through him we can be forgiven. I guess there could be a slight connection with the Lord's mercy and the supposed mercy of the kidnappers who wrote the note. One last very important piece of information about the note is that it was written on pen and paper found in the Ramsey home. Just a little fact to keep in mind as we discuss things later on. So now it's on to the investigation. So all of this took place very, very early in the morning. The police were called and showed up just before 6 a.m. John and Patsy explained to the police the situation, and the official investigation, or the search for JonBenét, began. This wasn't quite a murder investigation yet, because there was still the belief that JonBenét had simply been kidnapped. I include that because when the police got there and they started searching the home, they weren't really looking for a body, they were looking for signs of forced entry, or really just any sort of information to help with the case. It was during this time that a very critical issue started to arise, and that was the messing with, the contamination, and the destruction of evidence. When a crime scene is declared, it is extremely important that nothing is touched, nothing is moved, or anything done to it. Even the slightest of adjustments could change everything about a crime scene, so it is very important not to touch anything. There were family members, friends, and a lot of miscellaneous people coming in and out of the house, and, like I just mentioned, moving things around and being overall careless about what they were doing. There were family members, friends, and a lot of miscellaneous people coming in and out of this house, and, like mentioned, moving things around, or just being overall careless about what they were doing. The investigators at least had some sort of common sense to block off JonBenét's room, but as to why they let everyone else walk around so freely, I really couldn't find a reason why. Even if they justified it in it simply being gathering information for a ransom as compared to a murder investigation, I feel like they should still follow the same procedures. I don't know. That's just my thoughts. There is a report that one of the officers, Officer Rick French, approached a door in the basement that had a latch, but chose not to open it. He later said that he didn't feel the need to, as he was only looking for ways that a person who broke in would flee the house. After searching from 6 a.m. to 1 p.m., officials decided to ask John and Patsy to go around themselves and search the house for anything that they would consider out of place. They started with the basement, and it was behind the door that Officer French did not open that they found the body of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. She was discovered with a nylon cord wrapped around her wrist and neck, some duct tape on her mouth, and her body underneath a white sheet. I just want to quickly stop here and say I can't even begin to comprehend what this would be like if it happened to me. Doing all this research for this episode, all the sources that I read, they would say something like, and they opened the door and found the body. The police then went on to ... And they just completely brush over the emotional destruction of finding your dead child. Like, it's crazy to me. Having 2 young kids of my own, I simply just can't even begin to think what it was like for John, Patsy, Burke, and any other family member, like, and how they or I would act in a situation like this. It's completely beyond me that things like this happen, and I can't even think of the words to describe it. Now, I include my little snippet there because it may give some context as to what happens next. So once the body of JonBenét was found, John immediately scoops the body into his arms and brings her upstairs. Doing so was yet again another critical mistake in keeping evidence tamper-free, and this one action screwed up a ton of procedures. Now, John could have simply done this due to the overwhelming grief that he felt and did it out of just a natural reaction. Or, on the more cynical aspect, he could have done this purposefully, knowing that it would tamper whatever evidence was on JonBenét's body, potentially freeing him of any connection that he may have had to a now murder case. With the body found, let's talk about the autopsy. The autopsy performed on JonBenét revealed, as expected, a lot of things. The most pressing thing was, of course, her cause of death. She suffered a skull fracture consistent with something striking her head, and death by asphyxiation, aka she was strangled to death. Something called a garrote was found on her body. A garrote is a cord or a rope that is used to strangle someone. The nylon wire that was found was the item used to strangle her, and there were parts of a paintbrush that are expected to have been used alongside the cord. From what I can conclude from this, JonBenét was struck in the head, either killing her instantly or at least knocking her out. From there, this nylon cord was wrapped around the neck, and with help from the paintbrush, either killed her or at least made sure that she was dead. With no semen samples found, it's believed there was no sign of rape. There was damage done, so sexual assault was still a potential factor. Her body appears to have been wiped down after the murder, thus covering up more physical evidence. The paintbrush used for the strangulation was broken into 3 different parts. The top part, the one with the bristles, was found in an art bin in her room upstairs. Another piece was the one used for the strangulation and sexual assault, and the third piece was never found. In her stomach were the contents of what is believed to be pineapple. This does make sense because there was a bowl of pineapple in the kitchen the night before. Neither parents remember giving her any pineapple, but since the fingerprints on it were her brother Burke's, it's agreed upon that he made the bowl, and she may have ate some a couple of hours before her murder. All of the family members did submit blood samples in cooperation with the investigation. There were blood and DNA samples taken from different items, and with the technology that they had back in 1996, determined there to be unknown DNA on items such as her underwear, the nylon wire, and the specific paintbrush. Originally, it was up to 6 unknown male DNA samples, but that number was refined down to 2 male DNA samples in 2016 thanks to newer testing. Forensic pathologist Michael Baden says that there is a little to no chance that this was a stranger murder, but in turn was a close family member. I do have to add here that I do find it a little bit weird that these 2 DNA samples were not linked to both parents. The fact that it was undetermined leans more so that it was an outsider who was involved, but I'm honestly going to take the forensic pathologist's word over mine, so take what I said with a grain of salt. So with the ransom note and now a body found, the massive undertaking of an investigation officially starts. As of recording this episode, there have been over 21,000 tips, 19 trips to different states in search for different leads, and questioning of over 1,000 individuals potentially connected to the case. This case is still open, so that number will only continue to grow, but it is sad that all of this work put in by the community and these officials have really led to nothing but dead ends. Another example of the police force mismanagement in this case was the pace that they were completing things. There really was no individual questioning of either of the parents until a significant amount of time after the investigation had started. There was a retired detective named Lou Smith who chose to come out of retirement and help with this new investigation. This was completely against the popular running theory at the time, so he started butting heads with people like the district attorney. He eventually resigned due to his belief that it was an outsider and that his view was being overlooked. So a little bit of internal conflict there within the investigation. There was a grand jury assembled in order to decide if the parents should be indicted for the murder. This happened in 1998, and it wasn't until 1999 that an actual bill was created. This charged both of the parents for what was essentially criminal negligence. This meant that they put the child in any sort of position that would allow her to be harmed. On top of this, there was an additional charge for John, the father, for all the tampering and destroying of evidence. Now, quick recap on that. He tampered with evidence with the moving of his daughter's body, and also all of the walking around of the house that he did and other people did right after the ransom note was found. In the end, however, they were not prosecuted because the district attorney believed that they did not meet the standard of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And to this day, no one has been charged with the murder of JonBenét. So as we move into the suspect portion of the episode, I want to give a huge shout out to user Cliff Truxton on Reddit. They did an intense deep dive on not only the case as a whole, but also shared who they believe committed the crime in extreme detail. Link will be down below in the description to check out that form. So let's start with the idea that an outsider killed JonBenét. There were some things in the house that could potentially lead to an outsider. Since the murder happened on Christmas Day, there were windows that were left slightly open in order to feed power cables through to power the Christmas lights. One of the doors was also found unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, but that really wouldn't matter because any individual could easily go in and out of the windows or that unlocked door. The Ramsey home was carpeted, so the masking of the steps made it easier for someone to sneak around. JonBenét's body was found in the basement, but her room is a floor up, so having carpet would make it easier for someone to move a body downstairs. Near the body was found a boot mark that could not be matched with any shoe found within the house. We talked about the unknown DNA samples, and while this has never been connected to a specific person, this piece of evidence could lean towards a non-family member, depending on how you look at it or what you want to believe. Now, there actually was someone who did confess to the murder in 2006. Alexis Wright confessed and was arrested in Thailand after he had claimed to drug, sexually assault, and accidentally kill JonBenét. It was quickly determined that he did not in fact kill her because there were no drugs found within JonBenét's system during the autopsy, and also the information that he gave to police was already public knowledge, so nothing new was presented. Besides Alexis, there really was no big suspect outside of the home. With that being said, let's now turn to the family members. John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey. It's to be expected that they would be at the top of the list for suspects. It's hard not to when there's no real sign of an intruder and the actions that the family took. During the investigation, the family was hesitant to work with the police because they believed that they would be, as I just said, brought to the top of the suspect list. They all had submitted their DNA testing prior, which in that aspect did clear them of any involvement. They all submitted writing samples to compare it to the ransom note. They were all found not to have written it, but Patsy's writing was a tad bit more similar to the note. I say that, but when I mean similar, it's very minor similarity, and it probably wouldn't be used against her if it was ever brought up. Another theory is that JonBenét was struck and killed in a fight of rage by either parent, and then it was staged to look like a break-in and a murder, including that misleading ransom note. It was determined through the investigation, including interviews with Burke, that both parents had no issue with managing their anger, and that this was actually a really loving family who apparently never really used discipline, even things such as spanking. Even after all of these interviews, these tips, tracking down of suspects, the different reports, there still remains someone at large who killed JonBenét. Question is, will there ever be justice and comfort for those who were involved in this horrible event? Well, if DNA testing advances enough to identify the unsamples, then perhaps there's a chance. Until then, I personally don't think we will ever know. Before we finish, I would like to include one more theory, and once again, this one comes courtesy of user Cliff Truxton on Reddit. I will link in the description, as I said, their theory so you can see just how in depth this user goes. The theory that Cliff presents is that John Ramsey, the father, killed JonBenét to cover up that he had been molesting her. But seriously, you guys should really go read their theory after listening to this, because I really can't do justice on how much detail and research went into this theory. We'll talk about a couple of things here. So being a parent and living in the house, the suspicion naturally gravitates to them. Looking through all the reports and the crime scenes, Cliff shares that JonBenét must have known or at least had been comfortable around her killer. There were no signs of a struggle, and the overall description of the scene points to one person. The ransom note, if you remember, was determined to have been written on paper and a pen found in the home, and was also very specific in the details of the family and the father's financial life. Clearly, the father would have known all this information and then could have taken the time to write it out. It's very, very unlikely that an intruder would stop after killing and take time to write the note, because that just increases their chances of being caught. But if you're John, then you obviously live in the house, and if anyone passes by seeing you write a note, they think none the wiser. John also did frequently interrupt the investigation with the destroying or tampering of the evidence. If he is guilty, that's a great way to get rid of anything that could be used against you. JonBenét had been wiped down when she was murdered, so if he had been molesting her, this was done in order to cover that aspect up. One big reason that both Cliff and I say John is overlooked is simply due to the fact that people don't or didn't suspect him at the time. If you aren't suspicious of someone being a child molester or even a murderer, you won't find it. Through the investigation, the family was believed to be very tight-knit and a very wholesome place to be. We really don't know what happens behind closed doors or what happened behind the scenes in this investigation, but on the surface, John seemed like a great guy. But he did have a part to play in basically everything to do with this investigation. There are still unanswered questions regarding who wrote the ransom note, the DNA testing, or even what the catalyst would be that made John kill his daughter. When it comes to my opinion, I am persuaded by Cliff's theory, and I do believe what they claim. Once again, this is just a theory, and I am not saying that this is proof of anything. In the end, this was simply a tragedy, and unfortunate as it is, will probably never have a proper end. And that has been the murder and investigation of JonBenét Ramsey. With that being said, thank you everyone for tuning into this week's episode. Go down to the description and check out all the links I have down there, and also my last week's episode. If you are listening on a platform that does allow you to comment, please share with me your thoughts on this topic, or also potential topics for me to discuss in future episodes. Thank you all again for listening, and I will see you all next week.